And typically, startups that die, they die because either they built the wrong thing or they just ran out of money. And the thing is, if you have enough money, you actually can survive building the wrong thing because then you can build the right thing and survive.
Welcome to Diwan podcast, conversations with founders and investors in the US from MENA origins. Our guest today is Mohammad Musa. Mohammad is the founder and CEO of Deepen.ai. He also teaches engineering management at Santa Clara University and teaches product management at faculty. Before that, he worked for Google for almost 6 years. And before Google, he worked for multiple companies like Havoc, Sonics, and Emergent. He also founded Lifelong AI, a nonprofit organization. Mohammad started his academic life in Jordan at Jordan-University of Science and Technology, or JUST, but then transferred to Santa Clara University, where he completed his bachelor's degree and then master's degree in computer engineering. He was an active student. He founded the Engineering and Business Alliance at Santa Clara University that held the first business plan competition at the university in the early 2000s. Mohammad lived in Jordan, Ireland, Japan, and the US. Ahlan Mohammed, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Mohammed, let's start with your latest company, Deepen.ai. What is Deepen.ai and what exactly do you guys do?
Yeah, Deepen is a startup I started back in 2017. We're based here in Silicon Valley, and we focus on the understanding and safety of operation for autonomous vehicles, robotics, and driver assistance. We have three product areas. One is around understanding the data. So we have a data annotation suite that machine learning engineers and computer vision engineers can use ground truth labels. So the customer would use the tool that we have, our software, to label and annotate their data that they can feed those labels into their AI models for training and for validation. The second category is in multi-sensor calibration. We have a software suite to calibrate different sensors to each other and to calibrate the sensor to the system, whether it's, for example, a camera to vehicle or a camera to the room or to a drone or even to a robot that does any type of task in a warehouse or in a manufacturing facility and so on. And the third area is around safety validation. So when you're operating an autonomous system, you have to go through a rigorous safety certification process, which requires the developers to run through a lot of tests. And those tests are sometimes called scenarios in the case of driving. So you think of it as driving scenarios. And so we have a database of driving scenarios that can be used for testing and validation of the safety of the system.
When we talk safety, usually we talk also about rules and regulations. It seems that every country is building their own set of regulations for this industry. But you guys created something called, or joined something called the Safety Pool Initiative. Can you tell us more about that one?
Yeah. So within safety validation, like I mentioned, there are these scenarios or unit tests to test the safety of the system. So Safety Pool is a database of such scenarios. And with Safety Pool, we have an open-ended or an open source approach to listing all of the safety scenarios in one place. So we think that, like when you have open source software, it democratizes access to that software. We think that safety should not be a unique monopoly for any single company. And that if anybody runs into a scenario that can cause a safety risk, it makes sense for humanity to benefit from sharing that scenario and making sure that all of the participants, all of the stakeholders in the ecosystem can access those scenarios and test against it to ensure that their system is safe. And that's the underlying kind of thesis behind establishing Safety Pool, is allowing sharing of scenarios across all different stakeholders, including car companies, technology companies, even regulators that are mandating what type of tests or safety qualification is required for any vendor to participate. So this database is that resource that is accessible. And we have partners across academia, government, industry, and other players as well, like nonprofits and so on.
That's great. So who are the customers of Deepen.ai that use the software tools that you provide today?
So typically automotive customers, that's been our beachhead market. That's where we operate the most. We do have robotics companies. We do have also domains that are trying to bring autonomy into their world. So, for example, agriculture technology. There is a lot of sensors and robotics going into agriculture. In construction industry also, there's a lot of sensors coming into diggers and building and so on. We have some customers in those use cases, but most of our customers are in the automotive space. We work publicly with some teams at Honda, Nissan, at Ford, and some tier one suppliers like Bosch and others.
That's awesome. So now we know what does Deepen AI do. Can you tell us more about the beginnings of the company? How did you get into this? How did you start the company?
Yeah. Yeah. So when I met my co-founders originally, we were all at Google at different times. At least I was there in a different time than they were. My two engineering co-founders, they worked together in the same team at Google, but I was in a separate team. But after I met them, after I left Google, we looked at what area can we anticipate demand and can make a big difference. We didn't want to work on something that doesn't add a lot of value. Given that I've worked at startups before in my career as an employee in multiple startups, they always struggled around monetization and growth. And typically startups that die, they die because either they built the wrong thing or they just ran out of money. And the thing is, if you have enough money, you actually can survive building the wrong thing because then you can build the right thing and survive. So for Deepen, since day one, I wanted to make sure that we don't run out of money. And that was by basically taking control of the destiny. So to keep, to answer the question directly, we looked at what the market needed and we listened to customers early on, especially in this autonomy, computer vision space. We looked at augmented reality at the time. We looked at AI applications and we looked at automotive, robotics, and so on. And across all of these segments, the customers needed data annotation. And it was clear also that was data annotation for 3D sensors, for multi-sensor systems was difficult and not widely available, except for a couple of companies that have been doing it before anyone else. And therefore they had to build it in-house by themselves. So we picked that area as a way to generate revenues quickly and to also serve a clear market need. And we basically followed a pretty principled approach in focusing on what the customer wants and would pay for rather than what we really would like to do ourselves, because I had personally been interested in doing something around augmented reality. Interesting enough, like even till today, we're 2023, 6.5 years later from starting the company, augmented reality hasn't really caught up. And to a certain extent, even autonomous vehicles hasn't really caught up. It's been, there are more deployments now than they were back in 2017, but it's not at the scale that people were hoping for.
That I want to go back to the money topic and ask about fundraising. But you said if you had enough money, you could continue building their own thing. And because you focused a lot more on what the customers need than what you wanted to build, which was in your case, augmented reality, you built a product that now there's big brand names using your product. Versus if you had enough money to build augmented reality, we don't know what would have happened. But let me go back to the money thing. Did you raise money from venture capital firms in the Bay Area or in the MENA region? How was the fundraising journey for Deepen AI?
This was my first real attempt at building a company that is venture scale. And raising as a first time entrepreneur, even when you're making revenues, is counterintuitive. And this is what a lot of people do not understand when they try to build a small company. Startups are meant to be very fast growth and addressing very large market need so that they can return what they call it, return the fund that the investors are investing from. Just to keep it simple, let's say you go to pre-seed fund that is a $10 million size fund. So meaning that this fund is going to invest maybe 20 checks in 20 companies. Each check is only $500,000. And what they aim for with each investment is that the return for that company is the entire fund, meaning that from each 500,000 investment, they hope to get at least 10 million back, which is a 20x return. This is the kind of math that venture capitalists go through when they look at startups. And even though I understood that, having lived in the Valley and went to universities that focus on entrepreneurship and so on, I didn't really internalize that till later in my career, as I also started looking at investments and investing myself. That lack of understanding, it made the language and the fit of my pitch to VCs very unproductive, because what I was pitching initially was how to build a small business that is profitable. And because I worked at startups that were not profitable, that was a big concern for me, right? And this is where I think I should have thought about fundraising like I think about products. So when I do product management, I'm more obsessed about the customer and the customer need and building something that will get the customer what they want. But when I was fundraising initially in the early years, I focused more on what the company wants, which was just some initial capital to hire more engineers and build more products so that we can grow and be profitable. The thing is, and this is very typical of Arabs in general, if not, we don't like to lose money, right? Like, I don't want to build a business that loses money. The thing is, startups are actually meant to be fast growing, not necessarily profit generating. And that concept, a lot of entrepreneurs don't get very quickly. So a company like Amazon, for example, was losing money for 23 years, but there was enough investors that were willing to value a company high enough to keep pouring more money in and keep it alive until now it's become almost $1 trillion valuation. But that doesn't happen. Right? That's a very edge case, an exception. And people get overly obsessed with those extreme stories like Amazon, like Tesla, like Facebook or Google, where these successes have been phenomenal, but a lot of things worked out very well to enable that. So coming back to my experience, when I was fundraising initially, the kind of metrics and the kind of growth goals that I was setting were just very humble and in line to get us to profitability. So
Yeah. So this is the Silicon Valley model that people always talk about. Grow fast, eliminate all competition, and become the number one player in the market. And don't worry about profitability. This is the VC model of funding startups, but it's not the only way to fund startups, right?
yeah, and just so there's one critical point, I think it's a piece of advice that I now give to entrepreneurs I work with is everything at the right number would make sense for both sides. So for example, even though if I was raising for a small medium business, which let's say would exit at 10 million, then if the VC invested at a 2 million valuation and they put a million, then they would be happy because they own half the company and they get truly 5x in 2 years. That's actually pretty good if that's what they wanted, if that type of fund was focusing on this kind of return. But you are giving up a lot of ownership in that process. The thing that a lot of, let's call them first time entrepreneurs, is that they over index the valuation piece, which makes the conversation meaningless for the VC. And then we don't align on the exit criteria for both parties to be successful or to have a win relationship. Yes, of course, the VC would want the startup to succeed, but they want to have enough stake for that investment to be meaningful. And I think these two factors, right? Like the valuation, the mathematics, as well as the fit in terms of how fast you can grow and how much value you can create in the process. So those were the two mistakes I made. And to answer your question, what I opted to do instead is because I didn't realize this early enough in my early discussions when I first founded the company is rely on revenues and raise from angel investors who are people that trusted me and worked with me before, or they've met me through very credible resources. A lot of that investment was really in the people rather than in the company or the technology. And basically that eliminated the need for, oh, are you going to make me 100x return? This is how they were thinking. You and your team are a bunch of smart people. You seem to be solving important problems for a growing and important space. So we'll give you money and hopefully be part of the journey. If you make us money at the end, great. If the money is lost, this is how life with startups, and it's a risk, but we want to be part of something great. And you look like the right people for us to invest in. So the demand and the criteria for success for those investors or the angel investors that came in was more aligned with the stage and the level of maturity that we had, both from a technology perspective as well as from leadership and personal growth that we had as a team.
I want to move to another topic. I want to move to your early beginnings. You started your academic life in Jordan, studied there for 2 years, and then you transferred to Santa Clara University in California. First, maybe tell us why did you make that move? And if you can, tell us about the differences between studying a bachelor's degree in computer engineering between Just or Jordan University and Santa Clara University.
Yeah, my time at Just was really good. Actually, the technical foundation that I had at Just was so much better than anything I saw here in the US, actually. Maybe I would say Just was on par with the level of graduate education that you get at Stanford in terms of technical depth and quality of academics. However, like while I was at Just, I was doing well as a student, but the level of practical use of the technology and the level of experience that we were exposed to was always limited. And so this was back in 2001. The web was catching the world by surprise, but it was also when the dot-com bust happened. So there was a lot of mixed opinions on should engineering be focused more on the double E side of the world, the electrical engineering, chips, semiconductor, electronics sort of thing, or should it work into the servers and what companies like Sun Microsystems and Yahoo and Google were operating at the time, and going on the web and HTML and so on. So at that point, it was pretty clear that if I stayed in Jordan, I would shift more into the electronics and communications telecom side of the world, which where a lot of my friends who stayed in Amman, that's where they went themselves. They worked to work for Fastlink at the time and so on. While when I in the US, the academics were weaker, but the practicality was a lot higher. And also the people you get exposed to along the way here, whether students or teachers, many of them are working at Sun or at Yahoo or Microsoft and IBM and so on, and not in research capacity. So we've had professors in Just that worked at IBM and other big companies, very reputable, very great companies, but they had research positions. So it was very heavy on academia, which if that's what you want, I think that's perfectly fine. But what I got in the Valley was very heavy on practicality. Even though I only studied 2 years in Just, that basically carried me till the end of grad school in America from an academic perspective. But the practicality here was a lot more evident. And what you get exposed to from internship perspective, even other students who are going and working in companies around the area, especially in Silicon Valley, it was just amazing. Sun Microsystems, they used to be called the dot and the dot com. And that's how important they were at the time. It's funny that we talk about Sun, people don't know, but Sun stands for Stanford University Network. And they were super important to the early beginnings of the web. Then they were acquired by Oracle.
Muhammad, you're saying that there's stronger ties of connections between academia and business, especially in Silicon Valley. A lot of companies are starting, big corporations are there. Was it easy to find a job after you graduated from Santa Clara University?
So I graduated in 2003, which was one of the worst times for foreign students to be looking for a job in the US. A lot of the companies were going through layoffs, and many of the employers were not giving H-1B sponsorship, which is a work visa, to international students. So at the time, I had a problem finding a job in the Valley immediately because of the sponsorship situation. And also because of the lack of experience of actual practical experience compared to my peers. So a lot of my peers were getting internships from the first year that they arrived. When I transferred 2 years in, I didn't get all the credit. So when I transferred as a first year student instead of a second year student, and I had to make up for the lost time. So I basically spent my 2 years just finishing my degree in 2 years instead of 3 years so that I don't lose time. And that ended up actually hurting me from a job perspective because I wasn't as skilled as my peers who had internships, at least 3 internships in big companies. And I managed to get one internship, but it turned out that the position that I got was not super technical. So it was more scripting rather than software engineering. It was good experience, but it wasn't the experience that you need to become a software engineer at a company like Google or Xilinx or any of those. So I found a job in a neighboring town in Sacramento. It was 2 hours away from the Bay Area. And that was at a elevator company. I had a connection there who introduced me. I passed through the interviews and actually my experience, even in that scripting position, was relevant for them. So I joined there as a software engineer. And in that year, basically, I improved my software skills enough to then get a job back in the Bay Area in Silicon Valley at one of the best companies here, which was Xilinx at the time. So by 2004, I was back in the Bay Area at Xilinx with a much better position and a much better job, especially because of the experience that I got in that my 1 year away.
And how did you end up joining Google? Was it hard to join Google? Did you need employees from there to refer you? Any connections? Or was it just you applied online and got the job?
So it's just a funny story. When I got the job, the recruiter is the one who reached out to me. I did not apply online. She reached out to me and basically I had the introductory call and they were like, yeah, we want you to fly on site, do the interview. I did that and then they gave me the offer. But before that, I applied to Google multiple times, sometimes through friends and others online. And it didn't progress that much before. But in this particular instance, it was them reaching out, not the other way around.
You joined Google, so you made it, but then less than 6 years in, you left. Why did you leave? What did you do right after?
I looked at my growth in terms of where I wanted to be in the future and what it would take for me to get to where I want if I stayed at Google. And I think it didn't match. Google was becoming a very large company. The path for promotion and growth within the company to go on the executive track was extremely tied to a very high visibility, high impact project that you're assigned to. I did work in Google Apps, which was doing relatively well at the time, but then it wasn't doing well enough to be like a $20 billion business for Google. Maybe it would be $3 billion business. And this is also something that you learn along the way. If the company was making 80, $90 billion revenue, the division that's making a couple of billions actually doesn't matter that much. The division that's making 60 billion is the one that matters a lot. But the opportunities for growth within ads, which was making all the money, was also becoming very difficult because now it's very mature infrastructure and code base. And also the market dynamics were somewhat complex and competitive and so on. So the newer opportunities, they are more exciting and they have the potential to grow big. But in parallel, can they be big enough for Google to pay attention? And sometimes you get lucky and you get on those high visibility projects, the things pick up. So just to give you an example, at some point, Google Glass was viewed to be the next big thing for Google. And another time it was Google Plus, which was the social network product that was supposed to be the next big thing. And also Google Fiber. And even before that, there was Google Wave. Guess what happened to all of these things? They were all shut down. So I figured if I needed a major success that was high risk, high reward, I might as well just do that by myself outside of Google rather than doing it inside of Google. Even though obviously there are a lot more stability that you get by doing it inside of Google, but also the reward will be extremely less because you're not taking as much risk. So from what I compared to what I wanted to do and what Google was able to give me, it was clear that doing it by myself would be better off.
Yeah, so you mentioned that Google, which is something I really like at Google, which is experimenting. They are still entrepreneurial. They keep following new trends in technology. And talking about trends in tech, we had crypto didn't pick up as people expected. AR, VR also didn't pick up as people expected. And you mentioned glasses. And now we have the biggest thing that everyone is talking about is AI. Are we, in your opinion, are we in an AI bubble or not?
I don't think AI is a bubble. There is very obvious, clear value and clear time savings and almost like magical capability that you get out of it. Definitely not a bubble. There is, when you look at the startups in in the world, or like in this period of time, all of these AI startups and how much funding they're raising, there is a little bit of, not a little bit, maybe even a lot of mismanagement or missed expectations around what these companies can accomplish. And that's where the balanced approach between value, competitive advantage, actual, like how big can this be and how defensible is an AI company. All of these things come to bear into how you think about the market. But AI as a technology is here to stay, and it's only going to grow over time.
Before we finish, I would like to ask about two more things. First, can you tell us more about Lifelong AI? What is this nonprofit organization and why did you start it?
But the early days of Deepen, when we looked at data annotation as a need, in order to annotate the data using the software, you need people. And some customers wanted to do that labeling themselves, but it was considered not the most efficient use of time for somebody who has a technical degree. So a lot of customers would use lower skilled labor to do the annotation task. And by lower skilled, maybe like high school degree, just someone, all they need to know how to do is to read English, follow instructions, and use the web. Essentially, that level of skill, minimum wage type skill. We had our office in India at Deepen, and we were hiring some labor over there. And at the time in Jordan, Amman, there was unfortunately the problems that were happening in Syria, and a lot of refugees ended up in Amman. And some of them did not have permissions, work permissions to even get a job. And they were relying on minimal food stamps or the support that they can get. And people who worked under the table, they were not getting decent wages. And more importantly, a lot of these people were underrepresented, or let's call them vulnerable, from widows, orphans, or even elderly, that if you go and work under the table, you get underpaid. And also in parallel, you cannot grow your skills to get out of that underpayment cycle. Like, how do you get better wages over time? So Lifelong was trying to solve these two problems. How do we enable people to get decent wage while also growing their skill set so that they can escape the poverty or the problems that they have? And that's where the name comes from. Lifelong learning is we enable them with education, integrating them into cutting edge technology engagement like AI and computer science and programming and so on while they're doing work. So it was not a charity. It was very important for us that people feel that this is not sadaqah. It was actually they were earning the money by doing real work and then getting trained in the process. So they did annotation work for Deepen to earn the money, and they also were learning things along the way. And I had great partners in Jordan that enabled us, and we got some grants to help with the covering the cost of the educational side, while Deepen only paid for the annotation costs. But ultimately, by the time COVID arrived and also the living wages in Amman became so expensive, we couldn't sustain the operation. So we put it on hold. And that's the story of Lifelong AI.
So you lived in Jordan, California, Ireland, and Japan. Why choose to come back to California? California is expensive. It seems that people are not going back to office. Everyone is working remotely. Not everyone, but a lot of people are working remotely. High taxes, expensive. Why come back to California?
Yeah, the weather was great.
Okay.
The ecosystem also here is just phenomenal, especially in the Bay Area, California in general. I've lived in LA, I lived in Sacramento, in like different parts of California. And I can tell you, just the Bay Area has very different vibe. And the level of conversation on average that you have here is just phenomenal. You always meet and mix and network with motivated, groundbreaking people that are working on important stuff that really will change the world. But just to be perfectly transparent, I'm actually planning to move out of California because I think a lot of the benefits of California are diminishing. And my kids, they're at the age where probably I should focus more on what's better for them rather than what's best for me. But ultimately, for an entrepreneur, for somebody that wants to work on deep tech, there is no other place in the world that has this level of ecosystem and this level of access that the Bay Area and Silicon Valley can offer.
So the last thing I want to ask you, as someone who moved from the MENA region to Silicon Valley and stayed here, and joined Google, then left and started his own company, what advice do you have for founders in the MENA region, whether they're starting local, regional, or global companies from there?
Yeah, biggest advice is try to think about a position for your company or your business uh, where you can control as much of the destiny of the company as possible. And when I say control, not mean like you own a lot of the company, but you actually drive the company to have more independence in its ability to do what it thinks it is right. So if you take too much funding up front, then you give up a lot of equity and then you will have to basically follow what the investors want you to do, which might be totally okay if you can support it. Basically, if you can achieve the growth, then that's the right way to do it. But if you cannot achieve the growth, which is what happened with Deepen, is we picked something that works for us around actually not taking the VC money and going after serving the customer, thinking what the customer wants, and generating revenues out of that to be sustainable. So solving a real problem for a real customer and making sure that the economics of that solution works at scale. So one example I want to kind of people to think about is Amazon and Uber. Till today, Uber is probably not, actually, I know it's not profitable on annual basis yet, even though they do millions of trips each day, they're still not profitable. Why is that? Why is the company even still alive? Because the investors are willing to keep putting money in it and they see potential growth down the line. Amazon kept that for 23 years because investors kept the faith in it and they kept putting money into the company. Now, that's an exception. If you can pull that off, hats off to you. That's great. But if you cannot pull that off, then how can you manage making sure that your company is sustainable and the economics are correct? So you have to be making a profit. You have to be making a margin from whatever you're selling. And you have to have some differentiation that makes you stand out against the competition, against the rest of the ecosystem. If you do not make both of these things work out to your advantage, then the growth of your company will suffer and your ability to control the destiny of your company will diminish over time. Is economics basically that you can net some positive number after all of your spending and expenses. And second, the differentiation, the defensibility. This sounds like business 101 type advice, but you will be surprised how many even CEOs of public companies don't practice this very simple advice. So just because it's common sense doesn't mean it's common practice. And this is what I teach. I focus a lot on my students and even the companies I invest in is make sure you're defensible and make sure that the economics work out. Because otherwise, your company will bleed or your company will become irrelevant because you'll be replaced by others that can solve the problem better for their customers.
I cannot agree more. And I've seen that. I lived that through the VC firms I worked for, whether in the MENA region or in here in Silicon Valley. Sometimes we underestimate how important what their customers need, solving a real problem. And then, of course, the economics, the unit economics of your product or service. Ahmad, this has been a very insightful conversation. Thank you so much for being here today with me.
Thank you, Ahmed, and great to be here.